Welcome to the Reflective Soul Podcast. I'm Dr. Nick Latursky, your guide on this journey through the intersection of psyche and spirit. Here we explore the depths of the human soul, uncovering the wisdom of symbols, dreams, myths, archetypes, and sacred stories. Whether you're seeking personal transformation, spiritual insight, or simply inspiration, this is a place for reflection, connection, and growth. Let's begin. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Reflective Soul Podcast. I'm pleased to be here together today with Mark. Now, full disclosure, Mark and I are best friends. We've been dear friends for almost 20 years now. We are not only co-conspirators in life, but magical partners. And many of the stories that he'll tell today are probably things that we've talked about 100 times, but none of you have heard. And so I'm excited to talk with him about his spiritual journey and the events that have happened along with that. So Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks, Nick. And who knows, maybe something new will pop up.
I imagine so, yeah. So as I bring guests on the podcast, the first thing I usually ask them is, what are your earliest spiritual memories, and what were the meaning of those for you?
Sure. So, I would love to tell you that my first spiritual memory was sunshine and rainbows and roses and flowers, and I just can't lie to you that way. I think my very first distinct spiritual memory is from when I was in the first or maybe the second grade. And I remember being out on the playground. I was a weird kid. I'll just start there. I was a weird kid. I know a lot of people can probably relate. So I spent a lot of time on the playground alone, like the weird kids do. And all of a sudden, I got this overwhelming urge to use the Lord's name in vain. And having been raised strict Catholic, you did not do that. Now, my father did that, but my father was in the army. That was the language of the day, if it were. But I certainly did not, as a young man with a very, very spiritual mother. And I did. And I knew in that instant, Nick, that I was going to hell. And that just weighed on me. Like, in retrospect, it's absolutely hysterical because given the number of times I've probably used that combination of words in the intervening 45 years of my life,
Sure.
But at the time, it was heavy. And I'm like, okay, that's it, I'm done. And what strikes me about that is, Catholicism, which I'm no longer Catholic anymore, but we'll talk more about that. I'm kind of coming back to some of the things I really valued about that faith tradition.
Sure.
But there's a redemption story there. That's like the whole point. And yet I did not feel that redemption opportunity that comes with Christianity. I felt the condemnation. And I felt, the impact of, oh my gosh, I've just done this terrible thing, which now I'm like, they were just literally just words. But in that moment, that was just deep, deep, deep for me. And so I think that shaped a lot of how I approached my faith for the next several years. Wow. Probably until I was in my 30s. Yeah, I managed to migrate into religions that were a lot of fire and brimstone, in maybe not in words, but in approach, or found flavors of those religions where that was the message. And it was often you'll be forgiven if you do X or when you do Y, and X and Y were almost always unattainable. So part of that, I suspect, comes from, like I said, weird kid. I'm now out and gay. And I think there was a little bit of that weirdness. I'm also just sort of a weirdo in general, and now I own it differently than I did in the first or second grade.
Sure. Wow. So I'm just curious when I hear you say that, how you resolved that.
Sure.
Or are you saying you never really did for 30 years?
Yeah, so I was probably close to 30 when I finally resolved that. So, a little bit more specifics for people who are like, what in the world is he talking about? All right, so I was raised Catholic. I'm the firstborn of four. And my mother...
Doesn't that mean you're supposed to be a priest or something?
Well, according to my mom, yeah. And
okay.
I'm not sure where that tradition comes from, but, you kind of give the first one up to God.
Sure.
They don't take gay priests. Well, that's a whole different conversation. But at the time when I was talking with priests about it, and, that was something that would come up. When I was first in touch with it without being out, it was like, oh, I think I might have a problem. And they were like, well, you better resolve that problem because you can't have gay priests. And I'll just say, looking around now, I'm like, are you sure? Are you sure? So, my mother was a charismatic Catholic. Okay. And if you're not familiar with that term, they mean charismatic like Pentecostal in that term. Like the Holy Spirit has descended upon people, given them gifts. Mm-hmm. And my mother spoke in tongues very much like a Pentecostal would, or some Baptist denominations do. And so we were in touch with the fact that there was a spiritual world very early on, probably more so than many people raised Catholic in the United States. We prayed together a lot. We had statues in the house, just kind of a traditional Catholic household. But it was a lot of the kind of fire and brimstone, a lot of the sin, you've got to do it right, act right, be right, and not a lot of the joy. And I'm sure a lot of that was just me and where I was. I left Catholicism at about 18. I looked at the religion. I saw some things that just weren't quite squaring up for me. And so I became even more hardcore, and I became Baptist for a brief time.
Wow.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many times I've been baptized, Nick. So I became Baptist for a brief time. I tried to pray away the gay. I did conversion therapy, and that was fire and brimstone in word, not just execution. I'm sorry, not just culture and execution. And I realized a couple of years into that was not working for me. Right? I just ran into some theological problems with the religion, quite honestly, that I just couldn't square up. The interesting thing is that when you hang out with biblical literalists and you start to take the Bible literally and you read the Bible as a literal document, there are enough internal inconsistencies that for me, that just didn't work. And I understand that other people can square that circle, good for them. Mm-hmm. And then I met my now ex-wife, with whom I have 4 kids. Mm-hmm. That was that time, right? A lot of gay dads out there. We got married because that's what society expected us to do.
That was our generation. Get married to a good woman and it'll go away.
Right, right, exactly. We're still very good friends to this day. She's a really remarkable woman, great parent. And we got married, and she was Mormon, so I became Mormon. And again, just found the religion to have a lot of really great points. And then there was this sort of fire and brimstone overlay. There's a book in the Mormon tradition called The Miracle of Forgiveness.
Right.
And it's written by one of the prior prophets, one of the prior leaders of the church. And when you read through that, it's, Jesus died for your sins. You terrible, horrible, evil, awful person. How dare you make Jesus suffer like that?
Right. I've heard some people satirically say it should be called, it's a miracle if you'll be forgiven.
Right. And that's very much how I experienced that book. And so, 10 years as a Mormon later, it became just very obvious that our marriage was not going to work, mostly because I'm gay. And it dawned on me that actually was not fair to her, for her to be married to a gay man. Like, she's a straight woman. She should not be married to a gay man. Sure. And she's now married to a straight man and much, much happier. And I'm much happier for her. But it was about that time that I came out that I was able to really look at my relationship with religion. And I was living in Dallas, Texas at the time, and there is a church there called the Cathedral of Hope.
Right.
It's one of the largest, if not the largest, queer congregations in the country. And my therapist actually recommended that I go there and experience an affirming religion. And it's interesting, I'm getting emotional in a way that I haven't been in a number of years, so thank you for that. So as I was there, I had been doing some real deep thinking about my values, right? Not my mom's values, not my dad's values, not the pastor of the Baptist church's values or the guy who was trying his best to help me pray the gay away's values, but what are Mark's values? What's important to me? And I realized that I had a lot of values in common, and then I had a lot that actually weren't in common. And so the combination of going to a church where the message was not, Jesus died for you, you terrible, wretched sinner who belongs in hell, by the way, because you're fundamentally broken, whether you're gay or not. You're just, as a human, fundamentally broken, to one that really celebrated the fact that, God's a pretty great guy. And like a good parent, wants you to be successful, wants you to be happy, wants you to have a life that makes a difference. And so it was just a very different message. And I remember being there with somebody. I was in both group and individual therapy at the time, going through divorces. Was very hard on me, given the Catholic "you never get divorced" message. And I just cried after the first session, 15, 20 minutes. And he just held me the whole time. And that's when I broke out of that, that terrible, terrible experience for 30 years of feeling judged every time I did something spiritual. And there were high points in there, right? Don't get me wrong. It was not a terrible 30 years, but the overarching message was not one of love and acceptance from a kind God. It was, you're going to be judged forever.
Wow. So that must have been, I can see if it would have been really transformative.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Deeply, deeply.
Yeah. In fact, if I remember right, you've taken trips back to Dallas and visited that church since.
I have. Yeah, and I no longer consider myself fully Christian. It's just not where my spiritual path has taken me, but it will always hold a very special place in my heart.
I can see why.
Yeah.
So you've sort of opened the door there.
Sure.
What came next?
So what came next was a period of...
So I think this is shortly after this that you and I met.
Right.
So after all this happened, and you had this, kind of epiphany, this wonderful kind of transformative experience, what came next?
Yeah. So I did leave the Christian faith tradition. I attended a few church services. I just didn't find the right community for me to belong to. But I had been doing some work with a group called Landmark, a Landmark Forum, sort of the descendant of the S training that Werner Erhard had done many, many years ago. He was a contemporary of L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons and some of those folks. So I had taken some what I consider personal development classes through them. Some people are like, it's a cult. And I'm like, well, I'll just add that to the list of cults that I've belonged to in my life. Thank you very much.
Full disclosure, you invited me to an intro session with them. And what did I say at the time?
It's a cult.
This is too culty for me.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, it's fine. And I remember, I can get why people feel that way. But it worked for me. And so I did a lot more stuff with Landmark. And then... stopped doing that a while in. I'm just like, okay, this is no longer a community that I want to be part of. And really didn't do anything for about 5 years after that. And then, you and I were talking, I can't remember about what. I think it might have been like queer mythic archetypes or something like that. And I got really bored one night and was poking around the internet and found an article that included an introduction to chaos magic. And I started looking at what chaos magic is, which for those people who don't know, it's the idea that our models of the universe rely on random chance, random happenings, and that by plugging into the universe in different ways, we can control those outcomes. So there's a couple different ways to look at magic. This is one of them. And when I looked at that with some of the stuff that I'd done with Est and some of the stuff that I had done with my early spiritual practices in Catholicism, it just kind of clicked for me like, oh, this kind of makes sense. I can put my will out there. I can put my intent out there. There's a lot of parts of the Bible that back that up.
Sure.
And when your mother's a charismatic Catholic, you get a lot of, there's a book called Hung by the Tongue. I don't know if you've ever seen this.
No,
It's was written, I believe, by a Pentecostal or evangelical minister, and he goes into all of the parts of the Bible where it says the words that come out of your mouth shape your reality. And so, when you're praying, pray for the things that you want. Don't pray for negatives because the universe doesn't hear the negative part. It was very much like The Secret meets the Holy Spirit.
That's also a really wide tradition, though. I mean, immediately I think of the Navajo culture. Where every spoken word is considered a spell. Yeah. So you have to be very careful what you speak out loud.
Right. Yeah. So absolutely. And as I started to dig into that, I was like, oh, this makes a ton of sense. So I tried some things and they worked. I was having a hard time with a coworker, and I did a bit of like, hey, can she just taste a little bit of her own medicine? I don't want anything bad to happen, but this thing that she's doing right now is crappy. Can someone call her on the carpet, please? And it happened. And then I did a couple of other things, and I'm like, okay, let's just try this out. I would love to find a quarter heads up in the parking lot. And lo and behold, there's a quarter heads up in the parking lot. And this isn't life-changing stuff. It could be coincidence. And by the way, I'm actually okay with that.
Sure.
Because there's a lot of coincidences out there. But I just did enough experimentation that I'm like, you know what, this could be going somewhere. And that branched me out into exploring back into other magical traditions and practices. And I've returned in a lot of ways back to some of my Catholic roots, which has been a lot of fun.
Say more about that.
Yeah, so, growing up, like I said, we had, statues in the house. My mother did a lot of praying. I remember one time sitting in church and looking at a statue of the Blessed Virgin and just really believing that in a lot of ways she was present there. There was a communion with Mary that was happening in that moment. So, and that's not the only time I'd had those experiences. So, when I started to look at some things, I had a little bit of family drama earlier in the year. And immediately my instinct was, hey, let's go talk to St. Jude, who's the patron saint of lost causes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I started, asking St. Jude to help. And, there are particular ways of asking saints to do things in different parts of Catholicism. Catholicism's not a monolithic religion. I say that.
Imagine.
Right? Right? Even though I believe there's a large monolith in St. Peter's Square. But dad jokes aside, people express the religion differently in different places. So I have a young friend who got himself into some legal problems. And so I prayed to St. Expedite, who is a really well-known figure in hoodoo, to help out with legal cases and make things happen quickly. When I sold my last house, I had a statue of St. Joseph. And so there's again, Catholic folk tradition that St. Joseph, as the patriarch of the Holy Household, has, let's call it dominion over houses, buying and selling. Mm-hmm. And so if you take a statue of St. Joseph and the original tradition was bury him upside down in your front yard, facing out away from the house, he would help you sell your house. And there's reasons for each of those positionings and placements that we can go into if somebody's really bored and wants to know those details. But so things like that, I found myself coming back to the saints. I don't just do that though, right? So I actually have a great deal of respect for the Greco-Roman pantheon. Mm-hmm. And so I work with certain deities from that pantheon. So I've moved from being very much a monotheist into being a polytheist. And I just find that for me, that's a really, really great place to be. I'm able to incorporate a lot of what I grew up with by, I actually believe that there's a Yahweh out there. I just don't believe he's the only God. And if you remember, I spent some time as a biblical literalist.
Sure. The
Bible doesn't even say that he's the only God.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, otherwise, why would you have a commandment that there will be no other gods before me if there weren't other gods? And that's not the only place. But so for me, that has been amazingly transformative for my spirituality, because I'm no longer dealing with this idea that there's one God and he hates you, right? He says he loves you, but he really doesn't. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of gods. There's a lot of spiritual entities out there. And they are as unique as you and I are. And that's okay.
Yeah. It's interesting that you said that you don't look to Yahweh as your particular God, but I think, you and I have encountered, we referred to Jesus magic.
Yeah.
Jesus
is a good guy.
Yeah.
I don't know how else to put that, right? I don't bear any animus. Mm-hmm. Now, I think some of his followers are not people that I want to hang out with.
Sure.
But you know what? There's a lot of followers of other gods that I don't want to hang out with either.
Right.
And I think it's just unfortunate that Christianity has been hijacked the way that it has been by folks who, in my opinion and experience, don't follow the tenets of their founder. But that doesn't mean that I can't go talk to Jesus and ask him to, take care of my family, which is usually the kind of thing that I would go talk to Jesus about.
Sure. So you've given me a little bit of free reign, and feel free to stop me, and have it edited out if I ask the wrong questions. But, as you talk about that, I remember when you bought your home, that there was a whole lot of Jesus iconography around the house.
Oh, yes.
And
Yes.
I'm just curious how you worked with that and transformed that space into something very dedicated to one God, and brought it to the point of your polytheistic practice.
Sure. So when I purchased my home, a very devout Catholic individual was living in there. And I now know a little bit more about the order that he belonged to. He's a lay member of a particular religious order that goes back to the Latin Mass and traditional Catholicism.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So they, what's interesting is that when you go back to, and I'm not an expert in this, but this is just my observation. When you go back to when the Latin Mass was being done, it was a lot more magical than what the Mass is now. And I just recently attended my first actual Latin Mass, and I watched it from the perspective of a magician, and I'm like, oh yeah, this explains, explains why a lot of grimoire magic descends from Catholics, right? So they were basing a lot of that off the Mass, which is a very powerful religious rite. So it's different than like a more modern day Catholic in what they do magically in the space as I perceive it. So the first thing I did was I actually talked to the house spirit, and I let him know that I was here, we were moving in, it was going to be a change for him. And we came to an agreement, shall we say, that I was going to occupy the space. He does not like me, which we've had this conversation. I jokingly say my house spirit's kind of a dick. And I'm sure that my house spirit feels the same way about me. I was talking with another practitioner a couple of months ago, and he goes, sometimes it's just like a roommate that you didn't get to pick, and you have to come to a truce. And we have come to that truce. And I'm looking to move out of the area where I live now. And I've actually told the house spirit, hey, man, if you want to ease my way out of here, feel free. And I am more than happy to let you, in fact, start now. Go pick the next family that's going to live here, right? I will partner with you to get me out of here and get somebody that you like more to move in.
Get the queer couple out and bring in another nice nuclear hetero family, right?
Yeah. Well, and if that's what he wants, that's fine.
Sure.
I don't think I can report him to HUD for housing discrimination.
Exactly.
And then I went out and I talked with the land spirits, which in my belief are different than the spirits of the dwelling. And they had been so repressed in the space. You could kind of feel that. And so I'm like, hey guys, I'm here. And then I went and I feel like such a freak, actually saying this out loud, but it's so natural to me. I went and I talked to the giant tree in our front yard, and asked it, to help protect the house and, what it needed. And we've also got a really nice dogwood in the front yard. And what is interesting is having developed these relationships in my yard, my husband wanted to top that maple, and the maple called for help. I don't even know how else to put it. I didn't even know that he had planned to have a tree service come out. And I went into the house and I'm like, something's wrong with our maple. And he goes, well, yeah, I'm going to get the tree service out to top it. I'm like, no, you cannot top that tree. And I didn't know why, but I'm like, that tree does not want to be topped. And so I did a little bit of research, and then it turns out topping trees looks aesthetically good. It kills them, though. Like even a skilled arborist, it has a really good chance of that tree dying. And so just by building that relationship, and I'm not the kind of guy that goes out into the forest and talks to the trees. I'm not the Lorax, right? But just by building those relationships, it's been really fascinating. And we recently had a tornado rip through my place. And the tree spirits, the house spirits, the land spirits, they talked to me. They gave me very specific instruction on how to protect the house during that tornado. And I think I shared the pictures with you, Nick. If you go through my neighborhood, there were houses with trees in the middle of the living room.
Right.
I had neighbors where a tree fell through both of their cars and the garage. I live in a kind of just an interesting, my house sits kind of interestingly on the lot. So I have 6 different neighbors instead of just 3. Every single one of my neighbors had tree loss, most of it resulting in property damage. My house, uniquely in my neighborhood, we were in the tornado path. We had a shed in the backyard that I had been meaning to tear down, come down in the storm. We had a couple of pieces of lawn furniture, one that I had been meaning to haul to the dump, come down. And then I had damage to one of my fences as a result of the neighbor's tree falling into my fence.
Okay.
My house was safe. And I thoroughly believe, Nick, that the reason for that is that I had a good working relationship with the spirits, and they gave me very specific things to do with that storm energy as it came through, and it worked.
Yeah. Yeah. And I did see the pictures, and yeah, I mean, the pictures are dramatic.
Yeah.
From the area just around your house. Absolutely. Another thing you said that really sort of caught my attention was this idea of working with statues. And of course, we're recording this sitting in my temple space,
Right.
Because we live in separate states now, but Mark is visiting, and Mark can see that I have a lot of statues in my temple space as well. You came from a Catholic tradition where that is more common.
Yeah.
Certainly is not common in a Mormon tradition.
Right.
It's very much rejected. So I'm curious. I'm curious about that aspect of your practice. This idea of having these solid concrete images.
Yeah.
Of the spirits you wish to work with.
So it's a long tradition. And again, I'm not an expert on magical history. I'm just a enthusiastic amateur, so fact check me, right?
Sure.
But there's a long tradition of us connecting to the spiritual realm through statuary. The Egyptians did it. They had entire ceremonies that were designed to bring, and I'm not going to use the exact right words, but part of the soul of the god that they wanted to pray to and commune with into the statue. And I'm not sure if that's where Catholics got it from or not. I can't imagine that they got it from somewhere else, given how much of Egyptian history affected Greece and Rome, which then in turn affected Christianity. So that's a lot of how I look at it, is as a person who believes in spirits, and I believe that they are entities that are more complex than we understand. That a part of them, I like to think about it as the spark of that spirit, can inhabit physical objects. That's the point behind like making talismans. It's the point behind a lot of different types of magic, is you're taking a spark of the spirit and you're asking it to inhabit something. Sure. And that's how I look at the statues in my practice. So, for example, I have a devotional practice to Mercury Hermes. And so I have a number of statues, and I have consecrated them at particular moments in time that are meaningful. And I've asked them to do particular things. So I do a lot of writing and communication in my job. And Hermes, as you are well aware, is a messenger.
Yes.
And a merchant and a traveler, all things that are relevant to the work that I do.
Right.
And so I've done things like that. And so, I'm not kneeling down praying to the statue. I will occasionally, when I'm doing an offering to a deity, burn that offering in front of their statue, like an incense stick or something like that. But, I'm not grabbing a kneeler and, that kind of thing. Sure. So for me, that's how I work with those statues. And they're just nice reminders. Yeah,
absolutely. I remember we traveled to Rome several years ago.
Yeah.
And Of course, like I tell people, you go to Rome, it's not a church on every corner. It's multiple churches on every block.
Yeah.
But, traveling with you as a former Catholic and your interaction with those spaces and such was really, kind of transformative for me, to kind of see that through your eyes. And, it's funny because, we, on another trip, as I was trying to get, a terrific job that I wanted very much, I remember you suggested I burn a candle to Mary there in the cathedral. And evidently it worked.
Yeah.
But, I think for me, part of my appreciation of that iconography and that statuary and such has been, my interactions with you.
Yeah.
It's something that I appreciate. And I've gone on to pay attention to in my own travels, even separately from you. So at this point, as you are carrying on an active magical practice, and at the same time, you're a corporate executive.
Yeah.
This a PhD corporate executive. So how do you reconcile those two parts of your life? How do you keep your practice hidden? How do you move in those circles? 'Cause that's another big part of your life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I find that it's not necessarily particularly relevant at work. So I think about it this way: if I were still Christian, would I have this conversation? And the answer is quite often no. It just at least in corporate America, we don't tend to talk about it's the big three: sex, religion, and politics.
I have had a former coworker who sent me every email with "bless you" or "I hope you had a blessed week."
Yeah. Right. And so for me, a lot of that, when I get that, given especially where I live and where I work, it's just part of the culture, right? And so the way that I look at it now, because I've worked through a lot of my religious wounding,
Sure.
is you know what? If you want to wish me good luck or a happy day, cool, thank you. I will take all of the blessings you want to give me. There was a time, I think, when I might have been like, why are you trying to impose your religion on me?
Sure.
And I realize now that was just a response to having been so deeply hurt for a long time. And now that I've worked through it, that anger reaction, quite candidly, is no longer useful to me.
Right.
That anger reaction it was useful at the time. I felt like I needed that to stay safe from a religion that had hurt me. But now that I've come into my own spiritually and matured, it's like, okay, yeah, great, perfect, bless me. And I feel the same way about the people on the street corner holding the signs, right? There was a time when I would have gotten very angry. Now I just like to mess with them because they're fun to mess with,
Sure. Yeah. So you just said something really key, I think. You talked about working through your religious wounding. Tell me more about that. Tell me, because as my listeners know, I'm a professional spiritual guide.
Right.
And I deal with a lot of clients who are in the midst of religious wounding, particularly those in the LGBTQ plus community. So many of them become very stuck in a place of hardcore atheism or, a lot of anger, a lot of hurt that gets projected as anger. Talk to me about that process for you of working through your religious wounding.
Sure. So I think the first step for me was acknowledging that it was there.
Okay.
Right? Because I didn't recognize it as something that I had been hurt through, even though from what I'd shared at the beginning very clearly there was that. But it's just like a fish in water. The fish doesn't know that it's in water. It just is what it is. And for me, that religious overlay was what it was. And so I had to step back and go, wow, this is like if I lived in a household where I was punched every day, somebody would be like, that was abusive.
Sure.
But in a household where you are, constantly told that you're going to hell, that was not seen by me as abusive. I also believe, unlike a punch that's thrown, right, it's very obvious that that's intended to harm, that when people are imposing their religious views in a way that's hurtful to others, they often don't recognize that it is hurtful, and they believe that it's helpful.
Right.
And so I understand that we live in a culture right now where we value impact more than intent, but intent still matters. And so for me to get where I am, I had to understand, okay, this happened. Why did it happen? And then deal with the fact that the intent and the impact were two very different things, and get okay with that, right? Does it mean that I would want to relive that? Well, actually, I turned out pretty decent, so if that's what it takes, fine. Do I wish that on other people? No. Are there people who had it a lot worse than me? Yes. So it's like any other life experience that we go through. At least this is where I am now. It's going to hit different people different ways, and the best I can do is go, okay, this is what those people meant, and this is the impact that it had on me. Can I let that go, and can I be a full and complete person, and just function a little bit better in society than I did, when I was letting that trip me up? And I realize as I'm talking through that, I'm probably not actually answering your question about kind of what it took. Was that the question behind it?
What it took, or what your process was.
Okay.
I think you are, really addressing that process.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it was really taking it apart and looking at it, but that's how I deal with problems. I think other people might need to feel their way through it. I can't tell other people how to do that. But for me, it was really starting to look at the assumptions that I was making, to either accept or reject those assumptions as valid, and then to figure out what that meant. So if I take assumption one, that my parents intended good this way,
Sure.
and I examine it and I go, yeah, actually they did, and then there's another assumption that, they intended harm, and I looked at that and I'm like, no, they didn't, right? So I kind of had to methodically work through it. For me, that's how I process a lot of stuff. And then that's going to bring up feelings, right?
Right.
And so I have found for me that how I work through feelings is I just have to sit with them. I just have to sit with them. And sometimes that looks like literally sitting and being quiet and being with the feeling. Often for me, it means getting in my car and driving. I do a lot of processing while driving. And sometimes for me, that looks like yelling at things. Right? It's not very often, but sometimes that's the nice thing about being in the car. When there's
Sure.
just something that I have to get out, it's easy enough to pull over to the side of the road and let out that primal scream that just sometimes needs to come out of our system. Didn't do that a whole lot, but when I did, man, did it feel good.
Yeah, been there. I get it. So in this journey from your Catholic experience, your Baptist experience, your Mormon experience, all of these are highly hierarchical, authority-driven, for lack of better words,
Right.
structures where everything is really, all authority is really external to you. How did you reach a point where you claimed your own internal authority? Because you've just talked about being able to look at these things and decide whether they really are your values or not. How did you make that change? Because a lot of people struggle.
Yeah.
After being, trained for a lifetime to look elsewhere for authority.
Yeah. Well, first off, I am not above pretending that I have authority to do things that I don't have. It's how I've been successful at work. So,
Okay.
so I'll just start with that. Look, when I think about monotheism, right? When I was a monotheist, there's one God, and that one God is perfect. And so, to most of us in the Western world, a perfect creature is always and forever logically and internally consistent. And so, in monotheism, we have one God and one truth. And so, when you look at sources of authority, it is the person who can tell you what that one perfect God wants you to do. Right? Somebody needs to have the one truth, right? And so, for me, having been in so many Christian faiths, Catholic, Baptist, Mormon, you get different people claiming authority. and different stories, to your point. So when you switch from monotheism to polytheism, you lose the need to only have one truth. Right? So that's a lot of freedom that I've gotten as a polytheist. And whether I look at the gods as psychological projections of myself, actual spiritual entities, computer programs running the matrix, and honestly, I actually don't care what they are. It works for me. But I look at them as sort of little t truths, right? So I was listening to somebody the other day talk about why do the gods have so many different backstories, right? And it's a guy named Jason Miller for other people that are magicians out there. And he said, and I thought this was brilliant, that just like you and I sitting here have multiple different futures ahead of us, who's to say that the gods don't have multiple different paths behind them? They're gods. They can do whatever they want. And I think that's a really brilliant summation of the way that polytheism can work, right? It doesn't matter that these gods have, 15 different backstories. That's actually not what's important. What's important is, who they are in relationship to us right now in this very moment. And so when I switched from this monotheistic view where there can only be one truth and you must adhere to that truth, otherwise you're going to hell because God loves you, to one where you've got multiple gods with multiple pasts and multiple futures. And so what is the big T truth that comes out of all those little t truth stories? And usually that big T truth is that we just need to be decent to each other. And there are different orders of decent to each other in there. And as Aries or Mars likes to remind us, if you can't be decent to each other, just beat the shit out of them. So there are different things to lock into when we need to have different kinds of conversations in our lives. So that has helped me a lot to break away from this idea that there's only one truth to there being, multiple truths out there. And that's okay.
Yeah. That reminds me, one of my favorite memories of the last 20 years we've known each other is a late night conversation on a hotel porch where we talked about a difference between truth and accuracy.
Yeah.
And both of us have had experiences in religious cultures where the story, the myth, was considered to be accurate.
Right.
And gosh, as soon as we decided it wasn't accurate, it must not be true.
Yeah.
But on more mature reflection, there's often truth there.
Yes.
Even when there's limited accuracy.
Yeah. I come back to the statue conversation. So Saint Expedite, again, very common saint that people work with in hoodoo, has several backstories, right? Just like I just mentioned, several backstories. Probably never existed. Most likely just didn't exist. The story is that he was a soldier in the 4th century, and that he was scheduled to convert to Christianity. He'd been thinking about it for a while, and the devil came to him and said, "Oh, do it tomorrow. Do it tomorrow." And Saint Expedite stepped on the devil's head. The devil came in either the form of a crow or a snake. Again, multiple backstories, right?
Sure.
And he stepped on it and he said, "No, I'm going to do it today," right? Probably never happened. And yet, thousands of people around the world pray to Saint Expedite to ask him for help making things go faster, like hence Expedite. So, I mean, the story is almost certainly complete nonsense.
Right.
And yet, when I have asked Saint Expedite for help, he's delivered. And again, I am perfectly okay with that contradiction, because whatever has dressed itself up as Saint Expedite and is calling itself by that name is helping make people's lives better. And so I actually don't really care whether or not the story is accurate. Absolutely does not matter to me.
Just make sure you give the pound cake.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Exactly. I'm always a little cautious these days because there's controversy around Neil Gaiman. But I love his novel American Gods. And he has a passage in there that gets this whole idea across that there are many, many gods, innumerable gods, who have been forgotten, either because we're not paying attention to them, or even their worshippers, the cultures that believed in them, have been completely wiped out. And so, these old gods that want to survive actually need our focus and attention in order to do so. It's kind of like magical egregores.
Yeah.
People pour all that intention or will or psychic energy into it, and it becomes real.
Right.
In a way that has nothing to do with the accuracy of the backstory.
Right. I was in Milwaukee a couple of weeks ago, and on Marquette University's grounds, there is a chapel that was built in France, and then a rich family moved it to their French estate in upstate New York in the, I believe, late 1800s. And then they moved it to the grounds of Marquette. And they named it the St. Joan of Arc Chapel. Now, when Joan of Arc was burned, she was burned alive with all of her possessions. And so in the Catholic Church, to create relics, it either has to be part of the saint or something the saint touched or lived with in order to create what they call a first-class relic, which is part of the saint, or a second-class relic, which is something closely associated with the saint. Well, they named it St. Joan of Arc. There are not a lot of relics around because of the way that she died. In the back of the chapel, there is a smooth stone. And the story is that St. Joan of Arc, when she went to pray the night before she died, she wept on the stone. And so it is now a second-class relic. And so if you touch a medallion of St. Joan of Arc to it, you create a third-class relic. So talk about the statues. Catholics have the statues, and I have a St. Joan of Arc relic, several that I made, just touching it to that stone. And so did St. Joan of Arc cry on that stone? Probably not. Do I care? Not at all.
Right.
Not at all. That story has been the accepted story for 150 years. Thousands of visitors go to that chapel every year. And the chances that St. Joan of Arc ever even looked at that rock are probably really low.
Right.
And yet,
it's like when we went to Rome. Honestly, kind of the beginning of my healing from being, wounded by Christianity was our trip to Rome. And I still remember, we first got there, dumped our luggage in the hotel, went out walking, and saw this big, huge stone staircase and lots of people going up, and we're like, okay, there must be something up there, right? So we go up there, and here's this kind of unattractive old church. Turns out it was like 1,400 years old. And I remember we walked in, and there was this glass and gold reliquary, and it held a bunch of rusty old chains and manacles that were allegedly the chains with which Peter had been bound. And kind of the same thing. There's this little plaque next to that about which queen got one of them and which priest got the other, and they magically fused together. The story that is given reads like complete nonsense. And yet, I know for me, I couldn't help but feel an immense sense of power from that reliquary.
Yeah.
It was it was an eye-opener for me. Because we make things sacred.
Right.
As opposed to things being sacred in themselves.
Yeah.
Wow. What other things have you made sacred?
So it's a hard question because I now live in a world where almost everything is sacred. Right. So now do I treat everything as sacred in my day-to-day life? Not as well as I probably should. I've become an animist. Right. I actually believe we're all interconnected. Even if we look at like the Big Bang, the reality is that we're all made up of the same atomic stuff.
Sure.
And I think it's just dumb luck that we have language and we're more awake than other things that are made out of the same stuff. So it's hard for me to see certain things as more sacred or not sacred. There are things that I am more attached to than others. And so that's how I tend to look at those. I have different things that are more important to me than others around. But like I just helped my son move across country, and I gave him a car that we had. And I've spent a lot of time on that car. And as an animist, I asked that car to take care of my son. Right. So is that making the car sacred? I don't know. But I know that I believe in a way that, again, saying it out loud as a Cartesian dualist. No. But as I say that out loud, I realize I probably sound a little bit crazy, but I really believe that that car will take better care of my son after I asked it to very, very nicely than it would have otherwise. And I know that sounds just completely bonkers. And once again, I am actually okay if people believe I'm a little bit crazy. I was a weird kid. Yeah. I'm used to it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that seems to relate right back to your maple tree.
Yeah.
Even. Recognizing the personhood, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So what other transformative events have happened to you spiritually that we haven't talked about?
Well, I don't necessarily go into a lot of detail with these, but I have undergone some initiatory experiences outside of Christianity. I've been through several inside Christianity as well. So those have been quite interesting. I also look at just the way that life happens, right? So transformative experiences, once I embrace the fact that it's okay to enjoy life, right? which I didn't have that freedom for the first 30 years, which I think is unfortunate. But once I embraced the fact that it's okay to really enjoy life, I've allowed a lot of other things to be really transformative. As part of my job, I run events. And so I will walk into an event and I will do something to make the space sacred, to use your language. And for me, that transforms slightly in that moment. Like I recognize that I'm owning each and every time I do that, my power, my agency, my authority, as it were. And so it feels like instead of these big bang moments where something transforms on a dime, like what I experienced at the Cathedral of Hope with my dear, dear friend, that instead of giant transformations, I'm really opened myself up to the opportunity for each of those moments to be transformative. And sometimes it's just as simple as when I acknowledge somebody and truly say thank you. There are times when that is a sort of micro transformation that makes me better. So it has been a while since I've had a big bang, and I am really okay with that because in my experience, those big bangs are usually the result of sort of stunted growth, right? And so there was a lot of catching up to do, kind of like if I were running a race and I realized I was falling behind and I had to sprint to catch up, well, you're going to pay a price for that catch up. And so my transformative experiences have often been exhausting for weeks or months afterwards, which in retrospect might be why after, freeing myself of some of my early Christian experiences, I stayed away from religion for a while. I just needed time to recover.
Sure.
And I don't know that I need that anymore. Who knows? Maybe there's an area where there's a transformation around the corner. When I was doing all my work with Landmark, I went through a very, very intense program, and we coined a phrase called AFGO, which was another fucking growth opportunity. But anyway, we coined this phrase that we called AFGO, another effing growth opportunity, because when we would have those growth moments, which the program was designed to create, it was painful. It was work, and it usually sucked right before and after. And so if I live the rest of my life in a place where I don't have another effing growth opportunity, I'm actually okay with that.
Fair enough. I really appreciate the perspective.
Yeah. There's a lot that I seem to be okay with these days.
There is. I think that happens as you mature.
Yeah.
So I want to respect your time. I told you our conversation would be about an hour. But before we wrap up, I like to ask my guests for takeaways.
Sure.
Just 2 or 3 takeaways that you would like my listeners to get out of this conversation.
Sure. So I think the biggest one for me is know your values. We're told all the time in our society to know your value, like know what your worth is. I don't know that we spend a lot of time actually looking at our values on a deep level. I think we're really good at looking at them on a surface level, but it wasn't until I really started to explore, why this value was important to me. Where did I get the idea that a certain thing was important? And do I actually agree with that being important? So for example, one of the values that I grew up with was don't take things that aren't yours, right? And so I actually looked at that one because there are some contexts in our culture where like, yeah, stealing is okay. So, we do the starving person loaf of bread thought experiment all the time. And so, for me, I had to take that out and look at that value. And I'm like, yeah, I actually do kind of agree. I shouldn't take things that aren't mine. So I looked at those values, especially as it came down to my sexual orientation. And for me, that was the big value. And when I looked at that, other things fell behind it once I gave myself permission to break out of that. So I think that's probably the first thing that I would give as a takeaway. And I think that there have been times, Nick, if you don't mind the plug here, when we've really relied on your spiritual guidance experience to help me as I was struggling with, do I value this over that? So this is where that truth versus accuracy conversation came from, was me exploring how important is the literal truth when I'm communicating certain things. So know your values, I think would be the biggest takeaway. And then I think for me, the second is embrace your weird, right? So again, I grew up as a weird kid. I'm a bit of a weird adult. I supervise a decent sized team at work. They all know that I'm a little bit weird. I don't think any of them know that I'm a practicing magician, but, for example, they know I'm a little weird because I reference Greek mythology on occasion. Right, as a story. So there's or Roman history. I can't remember which general it was. I was telling this story at work the other day where we got ignored giving some expert advice, and then I told the team, well, the Romans believed in divination by birds. It's where augury came from, and when they took their ships out to battle on the sea, they would bring sacred chickens with them, and they would do divination by chicken. And I cannot remember the general, but the birds did not give him the go-ahead and attack whatever enemy group they were facing. And in one of the best lines I've ever heard, the general said, well, if the chickens will not eat, then let them drink. And he threw them overboard and let them drown. Went on to lose the battle.
Yes.
And so I had to explain to my team that if a leader is going to ignore the gods, then they're going to ignore us for sure. It's a weird way of getting at that lesson, but I have embraced it as a legitimate part of who I am. And because I'm a decent guy, me being a weirdo, I've done okay.
You can get away with it.
I can. And so I think that'd be the second one. It's just embrace it. We're all a little bit weird, and that's okay.
Good. Well, Mark, thank you so much for being a guest on my podcast today. We've been talking about doing this for a while, and it's really fun to take our many informal conversations and have one where others get to listen in. Yeah. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for listening to the Reflective Soul podcast. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Reflective Soul podcast. If this conversation resonated with you, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. When you do, please leave a review and share the podcast with your friends. Remember that your support helps this community grow and reach others who are seeking a deeper connection between themselves, the sacred, and the world around them. If you find yourself wanting to engage with more of my work, you can also find my spiritual guidance practice along with some of my writings at www.drnicklatursky.com. You can also follow me as Dr. Nick Latursky on Facebook or Blue Sky. Until next time, I'm Dr. Nick Latursky reminding you to trust your journey, honor your inner wisdom, and embrace the beauty of discovery. Be well.